Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. On the 3rd of September 1939, Prime Minister Robert Menzies announced to the Australian people that they were at war with Nazi Germany. Over the next 2 years, the Menzies government prepared Australia for the conflict that would eventually reach its shores in 1941. Part of Australia's preparation for war was participation in the Empire Air Training Scheme, which enabled the Royal Australian Air Force to grow from around 4,000 personnel in 1939 to almost 120,000 in 1944. Joining me to discuss the Empire Air Training Scheme is historian Tony Brady. Welcome to Afternoon Light, Tony.
Thanks a lot, Georgina. How are you today?
I'm very well, thanks. Jealous of people who live in Queensland when it's bitterly cold winter in Melbourne. So you're very lucky. But Tony, you've written a book about the Empire Air Training Scheme, The Empire Has an Answer, and it's, I think, an underappreciated part of Australia's intense preparations in that period after Robert Menzies declared that Australia was now at war in September 1939. Can you set the scene for our audience about what was going on when Australia did declare that it was at war with Nazi Germany in terms of our preparations that led us, and of course, then to participate in this scheme?
All right. Well, at that stage, it was probably prior to 1939. There were discussions about an Empire Air Force, and that went back to imperial conferences from 1926 all the way through. So the idea always existed to some degree. But in 1939, when war was breaking out, you had the ex-Australian Prime Minister Stanley Bruce, and you had Vincent Massey. Both of them were the High Commissioners to London at the time for their respective countries, Australia and Canada. And they met and they were discussing about the problems that England would have in manning an air force. They both knew that an air war and air superiority was going to be important. That had been talked about a lot in the pre-war years. So they knew that with everyone joining the Army and the Navy, that the RAAF would struggle to find the men that it needed. And they came up with the concept there, or pushed the idea even further, for an Empire Air Force where the Dominions would supply the troops to man the RAF. They put the idea forward, and at that stage, Menzies had promised an expeditionary force of squadrons to go over and assist Britain. But the British High Commission came back and said, and the government said that they would actually prefer the Empire Air Training Scheme model. So the expeditionary force was cancelled and plans were put in place to get the Empire together and see what they could come up with. That was the beginnings of it.
Tony, was there any particular reason why the Air Force was so understaffed that led to this critical position it was in? And obviously Stanley Bruce and Stanley Massey deciding that they needed to establish some sort of fix like this scheme?
Well, you've got to imagine that air travel was very new, and during World War I, we were flying biplanes essentially all the way through, monoplanes just coming in after it. And so air travel and air flight was still considered a very new thing. And defensive countries, you had Britain has always been the rulers of the waves. So you had the people within the British military who were saying that Britannia rules the waves and the Navy will win us the war, and it always will. And they didn't believe that air power could actually harm a Navy. But when it started to show that it could, then obviously the impetus changed to getting a strong air force.
Was there also concern that Germany had developed its air force much more than the Empire, than Britain?
Yes, that's the proof I was talking about, was Germany's demonstration of air power was showing exactly what it was capable of and how essential it was. So an air force could wipe out a land force coming across before it had a chance to do anything. So it was very important to start developing an air force that could match the German air force, or defeat it, in fact.
It's interesting. Stanley Bruce, who, as you said, was Australia's High Commissioner in London at the time, he stated that commercial aviation in Australia was so well established that aeroplane travelling in Australia was now on the same basis as the hiring of a taxi cab, which I must say in 1939 seems a bit of a stretch, but
It does seem a bit of a stretch. What he's getting at is that you think Australia was fairly rural and remote in those days, and travel around Australia, if you wanted to go out to any of the rural or remote areas, was by air. So it was like catching a taxi out there, I guess. That's what he's getting at.
Indeed. So tell me about how this proposal was put to Robert Menzies, who was Prime Minister at the time, and what his reaction to it was.
Well, I don't actually know how it was put to Menzies. I can only surmise how it was put to him, but it was suggested to the Australian government, which is Menzies, of course, and they actually jumped at the idea. They thought it was a great idea. He sent then a delegation across to Canada. There was a conference in Canada to decide on how this scheme would work. And our Minister for Air, James Valentine Fairburn, went over as the head of our delegation, and he negotiated over there. And this is where one of the misconceptions about the Empire Training Scheme comes about, is everyone thinks that it was just the one agreement. But for Australia, it was two agreements. And Fairburn negotiated with Britain solely. Originally, the idea was for the entirety of Australia's forces to be trained initially in Australia, initial training, and then be sent to Canada. And we would then pay Canada, as the other nations did, our portion of the training over there. Fairburn saw the potential, and obviously Menzies with him, saw the potential of developing Australia's aviation industry and thought we're in as good a position as Canada with our isolation away from the war, our vast open spaces to have our airfields and our training. And we had the added advantage, we had a lot better weather, despite what Melbourne's like at the moment. So they thought, wow, we're getting our share of this. So it was going to cost initially around about £50 million sterling for our contribution with our training.
How many people was that designed to train for £50 million? That's quite a lot.
Well, £50 million, they're looking at around about 26,000 air crew to be trained through there initially. That was an agreement. The original agreement was going to be up to 1943. So with that £50 million, what happened was we negotiated an agreement with Britain to train 7/9 of all our air crew in Australia to completed stage. And then the other 2/9 get the initial training as was the original plan and then sent to Canada for training. That then saved us £40 million sterling, which was spent in Australia on developing our airfields and building our aviation industry.
And what was Menzies' view of the scheme? Did you find in your research, was he automatically in favour of it, thought it was a great idea, a way to contribute to the plight of the Allies and help the Empire, or did he have some reservations? Because obviously we did have some concerns about the threat from the north, although that, of course, wasn't so present in 1939 as it obviously became very much in 1941.
No, that's right. They're still trying to mitigate Japan's entry into the war at that stage. So Menzies was actually fully in favour from everything I've read, all the newspaper articles, all the reports, all his presentations to the nation. He was fully in favour of the air scheme, and he saw it, especially once we were doing it majority 7/9 in Australia, he saw it as a way to actually build our defence without having to actually invest in defence. It was a training program for the RAAF pilots, or to send our pilots across to the RAAF. But it would actually, by having the aircraft in Australia for training and the pilots training here, develop us a sufficient deterrent to any threat at that stage. So I think he was very much in favour of it. Obviously, it's panned out because we couldn't have made the decisions without Menzies saying, yes, go ahead with it.
Was there any concern in 1939 that Australia was sending airmen overseas, or at least training them for another country's war? Was that a concern, or was there very much a sense that Australia had a duty to Britain and the Empire and needed to play its part?
Initially, the opposition, say Labor, was very opposed to sending any forces, including the initial expeditionary force. They ultimately agreed to an expeditionary force, but weren't in favour of any troops serving outside Australia at all. That's Army, Navy or Air Force. When the Empire Air Training Scheme came about, they slowly came on board, but I don't think they were fully in favour of it ever. And when Curtin took over from Menzies, it was already fully in flow, and he had no choice but to maintain what was happening, I think.
You said that 7/9 of the pilots were trained on Australian territory, and obviously the 2/9 in Canada. But whereabouts in Australia? I mean, places with good weather, obviously. So probably not Melbourne.
Well, no, they were trained all over the place. So I'll just run through a list if you like. So in Victoria, you had Nihil, East Sale, Point Cook, Somers, Ballarat, Mildura, Essendon, West Sale and Benalla were all bases. South Australia had Parafield, Port Pirie, Mount Gambier, Mount Bracken, Victor Harbour and Malala. In Geraldton, in Western Australia, Pearce, Clontarf, Orphanage and Cunnadeeran. Tasmania had Western Junction and Nile. Queensland had Amberley, Archerfield, Sandgate, Kingaroy, Maryborough, Lowood and Bundaberg. So, yep, all over the place. Mostly, as you can imagine, air training required space. And so they needed to spread them out. And so these airfields were put out into more rural and remote areas. And to this day, there's still airfields in almost all those places.
Did this scheme then enable Australia to develop its RAAF bases around the country? Were there bases that were developed during this time that, as you say, are still there to this day?
Yes, definitely. You can see some of those. So Wagga Wagga, of course, Amberley, you've got Williamtown. So a place like that, Point Cook. Point Cook already had the training school there, but it expanded tremendously, obviously. So there's different ones there. Essendon, to this day, is still a civil aviation airport. So you've got places like that all over. Pearce in Western Australia, if I think about those ones. So, yeah, definitely there was Air Force bases, but not only that, a lot of them became commercial airfields as well afterwards, so civil as well as military.
I just think of Essendon here in Melbourne and Parafield in South Australia, both commercial, smaller airfields, but commercial ones. It's interesting, Tony, South Africa was offered the chance to participate but actually opted out. But Rhodesia, which of course is present-day Zimbabwe, did have some involvement. Was there disagreement amongst the dominions in the empire about which countries were going to participate and which weren't? And why was there that disagreement?
There was heated discussion around it. Canada was very vocal. South Africa opted out but decided to develop its own air force. Rhodesia participated in a small way and helped out Australia in the early days when our recruitment was outstripping our ability to develop the bases in the first years. 674 Australians trained in Rhodesia. 514 ended up graduating as pilots, 69 as air observers and 7 as wireless air gunners. And unfortunately, 17 Australians were killed in Rhodesia in their training over there. So it was only a very small stopgap right at the start of the program. Once Australia had all of our training facilities up and running, that was no longer required. So, yeah, they participated. Now, you asked about the confrontation. One of the big arguments was under the Balfour Agreement, if you know about the Balfour Agreement, about defending each other, etc. The Balfour Agreement was that if England declared war, then all the dominions declared war. And there was much discussion about that coming into the Second World War and if that was the case, if we were forced into going in. When the Empire Air Training Scheme was being discussed, they didn't want England being in charge of sending our troops as cannon fodder, basically, in their favour. So Canada specifically wanted to maintain control of their troops and their squadrons, and that was one of the sticking points. Australia argued for that as well, but wasn't as adamant because we just knew we didn't have the manpower to actually, or the expertise to man as many squadrons as we could produce. So we needed assistance from England in that area.
Tell me about the experiences of these pilots. Like, how were they selected and where did they come from and what was the training like? Because looking at the statistics, there were 300 Australians died in the training. So the training must have been pretty risky, pretty intense and pretty risky training for the lives of these airmen.
Well, aviation was still in its infancy and I wouldn't say we're pushing them through. There's still safety and a lot of safety around it. But when you're flying consistently and you're flying in close contact with each other, there's always a chance of aviation accidents. So I guess that's where it comes from. And when you've got aircraft that have got 10 people on them, then you lose 10 people at one time in a bad accident. So that 300 gets whittled down pretty quickly. So recruitment-wise was an interesting part, recruitment and finding the right people. So Australia at the time in 1939 only had a population of about 7 million people. And of those, around about 900,000 were the eligible males between 18 and 35. So they needed for aircrew. The problem they faced at this stage was that obviously the Army was actively recruiting and everyone wanted to join up. So there was a big fear that they would lose all these men going off to the Army or the Navy before the Air Force could even start to get its recruitment and plan in place for the Empire Air Training Scheme. What they wanted to do was make sure they got out and got these people. And the other thing was there was always this theory come from World War I and continued through, which had some credence to it, that rural people, especially horsemen, would make very good pilots because of their natural ability to handle the horse, their light touch, And the feeling of the movement of the horse under them gave them that feeling of the aircraft moving. And so it gave them a natural ability. It did pan out to a degree that was true. So they wanted to get out into the rural areas and make sure they didn't miss any of these people. So they created what they called the RAAF recruitment trains. And they had 8 of these trains, 2 in Queensland, 2 in New South Wales, 2 in Victoria, and then 1 in South Australia and 1 in Western Australia. Each distinctively painted, so they were pretty obvious what they were. RAAF recruiting written down the side of them with the big roundel. They're called the blue trains because most of them were blue, but Western Australia's was actually crimson red and gold. In Queensland, they were blue and gold with aluminium trim, and they were very, very easily spotted. And these would travel the rail lines. And it was always known when the train was coming in. They produced stamps, what they call Cinderella stamps, which are the ones that you would pay to for war bonds and things like that to help out the war program. And these Cinderella stamps would say, yeah, the RAAF recruiting train will be in your area soon. And then they'd put a date on it and you'd know what date. And all the eligible boys would have been filtered through their local RSL where they'd interviewed with a few people, and they would front up to the recruiting train. And sitting in the recruiting train were desks mounted outwards at each of the windows, if you imagine the old carriages, with a guy sitting there who was the receptionist. He would take all the details of the recruits as they walked up on the platform and approached him. They would actually fill out their initial paperwork there. If they passed that, they would go through and have an interview. And if they passed that interview, they'll go into a board of 3 men who would sit down and decide. If they passed that, they'll go into the second carriage, which was a full medical examination, including x-rays and dental. And then if they got through all the medical, they'll go into the third carriage where they complete their enlistment, be sworn in and given a reservist badge and walk off the train as a reserve.
That's amazing. So you'd walk on as a private citizen, walk off as a reserve, all having completed these processes on the one train, the series
the whole
of carriages.
Lot. Yeah, a masterpiece of efficiency, the newspapers called it.
Yeah, quite so. Was it popular? Was it hard to recruit these young men?
No, the local communities, it became a bit of a competition to try and get as many of your local boys enlisted as you could. And the newspapers spurred that on as well, reporting. Each of the newspapers, you can imagine, in the day was owned by independent people within the towns, just a local person rather than the big conglomerates we've got now. So you get the local newspapers would start to write about that area and the little brag session of 18 guys tested, 15 were accepted. And then the next town would have to try and beat that, of course. So they couldn't have that. So it became a very competitive thing and they weren't struggling to find recruits, that's for sure.
Was there a sense of prestige to participate in the Empire Air Training Scheme, or was the Army considered a more prestigious path to go down, or the Navy? I know even to this day there's always competition between the services.
Well, you missed it. I was about to say, hell yeah, the Air Force is always better than the other two services.
Well, says someone who has been in the RAAF.
That's right. So the Air Force, of course, in those days, but historian hat back on now. Yeah, the Air Force was the prestigious one because you were getting to fly and you were air crew, although they were recruiting for other things as well, ground crew. But to be in the Air Force was considered a little bit of a step up to the other two services by all means because it was more of a technical service, and it still to this day is a bit more of the technical service.
And you're put in charge of a very expensive piece of military equipment.
Of course.
An aeroplane, although I guess the Navy gets big ships and the Army gets big tanks and trucks. So there's probably a competition which is the most valuable. But those aircraft programs, Joint Strike Fighter, they don't come cheap.
No, but nor does a nuclear submarine. So I think they've got that one.
No, indeed. The submariners are going to have their day, aren't they?
Yes.
This training, Tony, once you got off the third carriage and had signed up as a reserve, what were you up for then?
A reservist at that stage, paint a picture, would be a 18 to 24, well, up to 35, but mostly 18 to 24, 25-year-old boy or young man who more than likely hadn't completed any more than primary school. So primary school was the final thing. Year 14 was the compulsory age of education. And most boys then went back out to work on the farms or assist with the farm rather than going on to higher school. So the education level had to be raised to start with. So they had another program called the 21 lessons. And when they got off the train, they were usually given the first of these lessons. And they would sit down either self-guided for some people or in small groups run by the local post office, local telephone operator or telephone exchange operator. Sometimes a school teacher would actually have small classes of boys doing their 21 lessons, and they'd work through. And these were lessons in physics, arithmetic, algebra, trigonometry, to teach them all of those skills that they would need for navigation. Remember, there was no GPS or radar in those days, so they had to do all guidance by stars, and they needed the trigonometry for that type of thing. And pilots had to know just as much as navigators in case something happened to the navigator, of course. Every man was interested in knowing how to navigate to a degree. So they all had to raise their math, but on top of that, their mechanical and their electrical engineering skills had to be raised as well. So these 21 lessons guided them through a range of courses that had been designed. They complete one book, send that off, and it would be marked. And if they passed, they were sent the next book, and they'd work their way through. And then by the time they'd finished their 21 lessons, however long that took them, some very quickly, some took a lot longer, they would then go on the active reservist list and be called up when there was vacancy, and off they would go for their training.
And they'd go to one of those bases we were discussing in Nil and Malala and Parafield and Essendon and the like.
Yes.
And tell me about how they learnt how to aim a bomb at a target, because I thought this was quite an extraordinary
Talk me out here, because I think you're talking about the hanging above a target and spotting it as they go over. So
yeah, well, it seems like they would use a cinema screen.
That's correct. A moving cinema screen below, and they would actually sit above, and when they got to their target identified by the information they'd been given in their briefing, they would then drop their bombs, and it would actually measure and see if they'd hit the target.
And was that quite an effective way of training them in targeting?
Well, I don't know, to a degree. They did hit their targets a lot of the time, but they did miss a lot of the time. So it's hard to judge them because they're being shot at from the ground, from the air. Yeah, I'd hate to have been trying to aim something up and get it on target whilst I'm being harassed by gunfire from both sides and searchlights on me and, the aircraft getting around. Yeah, that's it. So it's hard to actually judge how accurate they were. They did wipe out targets. They were very good. Some were extremely good. And the better ones later on went on to a force called the Pathfinders. And the Pathfinders would be the early ones who would navigate, find the spot, and they would drop incendiary bombs to mark the target for the other navigators. So they'd only have to get into the area to find it and then head towards the flames, basically.
Tony, how long would it take a reserve just freshly signed up to complete the training and then be deployed in a squadron?
Okay, so you're looking at a variety of different jobs. So you've got the pilot, air observer, and you've got the wireless air gunners are the three main ones. So a pilot was from start to finish, and this varied over the period of war depending on need, and originally it was a little bit faster, but not much different. So on average, a pilot was 50 weeks, of which he spent 12 weeks in initial training, which is learning military discipline, military law, to march, to keep himself, nice and tidy, etc., etc. In that time, they would weed them out and work out who was and wasn't going to be suitable. And then they also chose during initial training, that's where you decided whether you were going to be a pilot, an air observer or an air gunner. And then sometimes the pilot wouldn't make it and he'd be backcoursed into one of the other trades as well, and so on. So pilots initially did the 12 weeks initial training. Then they did another 12 weeks elementary flying training. Then it went for 24 weeks at what they called service flying training. And that was split into two lots of 12 and 12, intermediate and then advanced. And then in amongst that part, they went off for a section and did 2 weeks at the bombing and gunnery school and then back. So that just fitted in there wherever they could fit them through. So in all, they did 50 weeks training. So you imagine that's almost 12 months to train a pilot from start to finish.
So when Australia signed up to the scheme in December 39, and you imagine you were recruiting someone straight away, they weren't going to be ready until basically December 40.
That's correct.
It certainly wasn't churning them out very, very quickly, but hopefully churning them out with a high degree of skill and effectiveness.
One of the catch cries of the Empire Training Scheme is that they could build a bomber in 12 weeks, but it took 12 months to train the crew. Mm. And if it took 12 months to train the crew in a high attrition war, you've got to remember once France capitulated, all of Europe was under German control. So the only way to actually take the war to Germany was an air war. And that air war had to fly over hostile territory all the way in order to execute any kind of attack. So it was going to be a very high attrition war.
Did the Australian pilots have a particular reputation amongst the Empire Air Forces? Was it a good one, an average one, a bad one? What was the view of the Australians and how they were trained and how effective they were?
Well, it's a parochial view, of course. But everything you read about it, they were held in high regard. Our pilots advanced very quickly through the ranks within the RAF. We had certain very, very good leaders who went right up to run entire sections of the RAF. So they were held in high regard, and not just the aircrew, the skills of the ground crew were highly, highly prized. So especially in the Middle East, Australians trying to get postings back into Australian squadrons struggled because they couldn't get out of the ones that they were in with the British who wanted to keep them there as their mechanics. So they had an excellent reputation.
Once you graduated from the scheme, where did you invariably go? Were there particular squadrons that Australians were sent to, or was it just anywhere that was needed?
Well, going back to the original agreement, part of the agreement when I said about the Westminster Agreement where they could actually decide their own thing, Canada argued for complete control of their squadrons and command of their squadrons. And as a consequence, Australia and New Zealand got that as well. But we, as I said, we didn't have the manpower to be able to do that. So we effectively got what we called, it was Article 15 of the Empire Training Scheme, said that each one would have its own Dominion squadrons. And Australia had 18 squadrons allocated to it, from 450 squadron through to 467 squadron. And one of those was never activated, of course. I think it's 465 from memory. So we had 17 squadrons in all. And those 17 squadrons were meant to be predominantly Australians. But in effect, to start with especially, they had RAF command with some Australian command in amongst it, and then a mixture of Dominion pilots. And then as Australians got fed more and more into some of the squadrons, they become more and more fully Australian. 460 became a very dominant Australian squadron, whilst other squadrons were always a mix of all the different nations. Now, having said that, more than 80% of Australians who served in the Air Force during World War II served in squadrons other than Article 15 squadrons. So they were all over the world in RAF squadrons everywhere. Sometimes the only person in that squadron, sometimes two or three there, but they were all over the world.
And as time went on through the war, and obviously Japan entered the war, did that become controversial that our pilots and gunners and ground crew were off in the Middle East or the Mediterranean, in Europe, and not actually at home protecting Australian territory and Australian citizens?
Yeah, there was a call for Jap dodgers. We had the war in the Middle East had pretty much ended, and the war in Europe were dominating over there at that stage when the Japanese had entered, or at least in control. So there was a call for Australians to come back and fight. And when you talk about the controversy, there was the issue when Darwin was bombed, of course. We had the problem there, and Curtin wanted our forces brought back. We end up with a couple of squadrons sent back, become the Churchill Centre and RAF squadron, and we sent some of our best pilots back, and they formed up there. And once they started attacking the Japanese, the attacks around the northern part of Australia ceased. So we didn't have that problem anymore. The other controversy was the men sitting in the Middle East who just couldn't get transport home. You've got to imagine the transport's being used for all kinds of necessary equipment at that stage, and to bring men who are surplus pretty much to the war back home was the lowest priority possible. So they were sitting a long time doing nothing. Families then started to get a bit antsy that their men weren't home. Men wanted to get back into the fighting or get home. So that's when you started to see a few of the white feathers pop up. And from what I've researched and found, there weren't any white feathers as a consequence of being sent out of Australia on a large scale by any means, because the census were checking all letters from 1942 onwards, especially for white feathers. So the chances of one
we should just explain what the white feathers were, Tony. I mean, these were people in Australia sending a white feather in a letter to someone on active service.
That's right. A white feather was sent to someone basically as a sign of cowardice. Usually some of the Australians, the reservists particularly, started to receive them. So the Air Force brought in the reservist badge to show that they were on call to be called up because they were looking like able-bodied men who hadn't joined up. So the reservist badge was assigned to say, this is a person serving, they're just not needed as yet or still in training. And then white feathers overseas were signs of cowardice. It was a World War I phenomenon that began, carried over a little bit when World War II began. But the white feathers overseas to the airmen, there were some in the army, but to the airmen seemed to have stemmed more from family members sending them, from what I've found. And I've actually found written records of someone confessing this is what happened, that his wife sent him the white feather from outside Australia to him in the Middle East so that he could go to his padre and say he's getting white feathers from Australia so he could get sent home. And so it was just a way of trying to expedite their trip home, either to fight the Japanese or to come home. So, that explained a little bit of the white feathers. But to this day, I've heard lots of stories of people who know someone who was sent a white feather, people who've heard of someone who's been sent a white feather, but I've yet to find someone who actually said, I received a white feather.
Right. It's interesting to read the quote from Air Marshal Peter Drummond, who is the Deputy Air Commander-in-Chief in the Middle East, who said of the white feathers, this apparently is intended to convey to troops who have been in some of the hardest fighting of the war that they are cowards because they left Australia. It is impossible to fathom the mentality of the persons responsible. But as you explained, I mean, there were various reasons why people were sending them, sometimes to try and get a loved one back home.
That's right. And don't get me wrong, I'm sure there were some white feathers sent from a minority of people, but I don't think it was as widespread or as hysterical as people think or as reports go. And as you're probably aware, word of mouth over time perpetuates these things and they become a very, very strong story and everyone knows someone who was sent one. But as I said, you try and trace it back to the origins to find the person and then try and track who might have sent it to them, and peters out pretty quickly.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine, I mean, aside from people wanting to get loved ones home, this sort of idea that these airmen were Jap dodgers, I mean, that they didn't want to fight the Japanese. I would have thought it was beyond their control. It would have been the decision of people way up the ranks than a humble pilot or ground crew or gunner.
Well, as I said, the Middle East guys had no choice. They were sitting there wishing away. They weren't happy about it themselves, doing nothing, waiting for transport home or back into the theatre to fight. And the guys in Europe, it was a much, much higher attrition war than the war in the Southwest Pacific. So to call them Jap dodgers was just ludicrous. They'd faced some of the hardest and most gruelling losses that you could ever imagine.
Well, I mean, I look at the figures. So 37,576 Australians graduated from the Empire Air Training Scheme. So 300 died in training, as we said before. 9,874 were lost in active duty, and that constituted nearly 25% of Australia's total wartime fatalities. So it was certainly, as you say, a high attrition environment to operate in.
That's right. Australia lost throughout the entire war about 40,000 people across Army, Navy and Air Force, just to clarify what you're saying there with the 25% of our loss. So we lost 40,000, 10,000 of those were out of the Air Force, and most of those in the war in Europe, the vast majority. So yes, it was a high attrition war and it was a very, very dangerous position. At one stage, 460 Squadron, who was our heavy bomber squadron, 460 Squadron had a turnover of personnel 3 times the squadron number. So some people did survive, obviously, and they stayed, but at some stage they've turned over their entire squadron 3 times. So that gives you an idea of the number of losses.
Can you tell me about the Desert Harassers in 450 Squadron? I love this name, Desert Harasser.
Love the story. So like we had during the Vietnam War, Rose, she was used to harass the troops on the radio and they'd always listen in and she'd tell them that their wives didn't love them and they were sleeping with other men and all kinds of nasty things. So the Desert Harassers got the nickname because they were harassing the forces over there. So they got the name the Desert Harassers, and it was meant to be a bit of a spurn and an attack on their reputation. But like all good Aussies, when you say something nasty about them, they embrace it and they take it on board. So they actually adopted the name of the Desert Harassers and stuck with that name as their unit name or their squadron name.
And what about Australian squadrons involved in the D-Day landing? Can you tell me a bit more about that? No?
So there are Australians involved in D-Day. There are Australians involved in Battle of Britain. You've got Australians involved from the Battle of Belgium, even, who were actually not Empire trained. That's before even war was declared. They were over fighting with the British and helping Belgium try and stop from being taken over. So we had Australians everywhere.
After the fall of Singapore and bombing of Darwin, of course, Australia becomes, as you can imagine, very intent on defending its own territory. What was Britain's reaction in terms of the Australian squadrons after that? Was it a bit more open to sending squadrons back to Australia?
As I said to you, Churchill ultimately sent back a squadron of RAAF to help defend the north of Australia. That was a very cunning little plan, actually. It was quite interesting reading about that. They snuck them back into the country. And some of Australia's leading aces also came back, and they formed up and they made this Churchill wing in the north of Australia, and their job was to actually take on the Japanese. And as I said, that was pretty much the only time Australia was really under threat. We were never under threat from invasion. We're only under threat from trying to shut down our supply and cut us out of the war, basically. So once the Churchill squadron was there and stopping the Japanese attacks on our coastal areas in the north, that was pretty much that threat gone.
I understand the British did give Australia a Spitfire squadron in May 1942.
Yes.
But this was kept secret from the public. I mean, there was a huge amount of censorship during World War II, and Australians really were observing things more than they were actually hearing things through official channels.
Yes, that's right. That's the one I'm talking about. When Darwin was being bombed, they actually snuck them back in, and that was the squadron that formed up and became the Churchill Wing. It was one squadron of aircraft and then a Churchill Wing. So a couple of squadrons are called a wing. So they called it the Churchill Wing because I guess Winston Churchill sent a squadron back. So it couldn't be an Australian name.
Tony, when you look back at the Empire Air Training Scheme and its impact on Australia's war effort and, of course, the broader World War II ultimate victory and its contemporary legacy too in terms of the building up of our Air Force and our skill base and, of course, all the airfields we have now around Australia that were developed during that time, is it considered a success? Is it something that we need to be made more aware of, commemorate more?
Simple answer, yes. So, yes, it was a success. Yes, we should.
That was a Dixer, given you'd written a book about it.
Dorothy question there. So, yeah, that's yes, yes, and yes. So, when you look at the Empire Air Training Scheme, you've got to remember it's also the Empire Air Training Scheme is like a joint name for the entire thing. So, you've got the British Commonwealth Air Plan, you've got the Joint Air Plan, or the Commonwealth Air Training Plan, are all the same thing, all under the Empire Air Training. Australia called ours the Empire Air Training Scheme. Now, when you look at the whole thing, that's the largest aviation training program that was ever conducted, ever. We've never had anything on that scale and never will have anything on that scale again. So in itself, that should be remembered just for that. Now, the second reason why it should be remembered, it was far and away Australia's largest contribution to World War II. It was Canada's largest contribution to World War II. It was more than likely New Zealand's. I haven't looked into it, but I dare to say it was New Zealand's largest contribution to World War II. It left Australia at the end of the war as the fourth largest air force in the world from, as you said, 3,500 personnel it was. And the figure you stated at the start, 120,000, it's 183,000. So a little bit more than that. 183,000 in November of 44.
Yeah, that's a huge jump. I can't do the maths quite that quickly, but that's
a massive increase.
Many-fold increase.
And for anyone who's ever done any kind of business or any kind of workplace thing, to actually expand that large, you have to have the training facilities, you have to have the infrastructure, you have to have the trainers. You've got to train the people to then train the next level, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's not a simple process. So it is a massive scheme. It would be one of the world's largest ever training schemes. I can't think of one that's equivalent. So that's that. It also saw the development, as we said, of the airfield and infrastructure across the nation. It raised the collective education level through the 21 lessons. You've got a whole generation who were only educated to primary school suddenly have electronic, mechanical, engineering skills. And those that survived, as we said, 10,000 of them didn't, but 30,000 did. 30,000 come back, and those skills went into our industry and our manufacturing. And if you have a look at some of the people through time, which is one of my other projects I'd love to do, if you have a look at the people through time, you'll find that those people became the heads of industry. Without a doubt, they went on to be heads of industry. We know that airline industry grew from people who came straight out of the Empire training scheme. So it raised that collective education. It also increased our manufacturing industry and aviation, but in all other aspects, because we had to provide machinery to build the machinery to build aircraft. So it pretty much was like a mini industrial revolution for Australia. Australia didn't have very much manufacturing prior to World War II. In order to build the aircraft that we ultimately built, we had to import the tools to make the tools to build the aircraft. So we had to bring the blueprints in, the whole lot. We didn't have any of that. So yes, it is a big project.
And it's really interesting to reflect on how the circumstances can actually fast track a lot of these developments. So industrialisation of Australia increased our manufacturing capacity, increased our skills-based, and educating a generation all was able to happen in a 4-5 year period, and it had to happen. I mean, it was necessary. Without that effort, and it was a collective effort obviously across the empire, the course of the war may very well have changed.
Exactly. And the one last thing I'll add to that, benefits of it that's still going on, if you want to see something that's still going on today. Australia had a very strong alliance with Britain at that stage. But when America came in, and there was a question asked in the newspapers and polls, should Australia change our allegiance to Britain and follow America? Should we partner with America and look at our allegiance to be America? Australians unreservedly said no. They wanted to keep their association with Britain, but they also wanted an association with America. And so that built that strong bond between Australia, Britain and America that still exists today, and we see it in AUKUS. And so without that foundation, we probably might not have AUKUS now.
Well, indeed. AUKUS is, I always say, it's ANZUS 2.0. It's an evolution of that agreement. Yep. Tony, it's been an absolute delight to talk to you today about the Empire Air Training Scheme. Thank you so much for bringing this story to our listeners on Afternoon Light. I've really enjoyed it.
You're welcome. Thank you. I've had fun too.
That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook.